So we're going to begin with the cardiac function, which is an introduction to the functional anatomy of the cardiovascular system. Okay. So our first learning objective is to have a general understanding of the components that make up the cardiovascular system. So we'll talk about the structural units here. And the components are the heart, which is the muscular pump, the blood vessels, which run throughout the body, and they include both veins and arteries, as well as capillaries, and then the actual blood that is inside these vessels. All three of these components are essential to the overall functioning of the cardiovascular system. The function is to transport substances. What are some of those things? Oxygen and nutrients to all of our cells. Okay, very, very important. And this exchange happens at the capillary beds. It also is going to remove waste from cells to the liver and to the kidneys. So when we think about the excretion, we want to think about the filtering and removal of waste through several different organs, and that is also sort of conducted through the blood, especially the kidneys. The kidneys help to filter the blood and remove that waste. Hormones, so hormones, immune cells, clotting proteins, that are going to specific target tissues or cells in the bodies can also use the blood as sort of a highway to transport from one point to the other. And we saw this when we look at the endocrine system, for example, when hormones are released from areas in the brain, they are then sent into the blood to be dispersed to various target organs. So this is just an example of the many different substances that can be transported in the blood. Now let's look at the overall structure of the heart. So here's the heart. And we want to think about the attachment to several of these important vessels at the top, and then a few that are here at the bottom. Now the heart has four chambers, as we can see. There are two smaller chambers above. Here's the right atrium, and here's the left atrium. And the atria are considered receiving chambers. In the little GIF that I have at the side here, you can see how the atria receive blood from these veins, whether it be the pulmonary veins receiving blood to the left atrium, or the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava that bring blood back to the right atrium. On either side of the heart, the atria are receiving chambers. The atria will send that blood down to the ventricles, which are the other two chambers. These are much larger and at the bottom of the heart. These are going to be the ejection chambers. So they're going to be the chambers that actually pump blood out into the relative circulatory systems. So the right ventricle, for example, pumps blood out into the pulmonary circulation. This is the pulmonary artery or trunk, and then it divides to supply each lung. You can see it splitting off here to go to the left lung and then the right lung. And that is where oxygen is picked up, right? So the blue color here tells us, although this is an artery, it has poorly oxygenated blood that is going to the lungs to be exchanged for oxygen. From there, we come back from the lungs via pulmonary veins. Again, although these are red in color, these are veins because they're coming back to the heart. So when we think about a vein versus an artery, it's not necessarily whether it has oxygenated or a poor oxygen poor blood, it is its direction of flow with respect to the heart. So pulmonary trunk or pulmonary artery leaves the heart, and then pulmonary veins come back to the left atrium. All right. So that is sort of the general flow of the heart. So if you think about blood in the circulatory system, it's going to come through the heart. All of the blood has to come through the heart in order to enter the pulmonary circulation and then have those exchange of gases and then come back to the heart to be circulated to the rest of the body. If you look at some of the major vessels here, the aorta, for example, will leave the left ventricle. Here's the left ventricle. The exiting point to that goes into the aorta, and then this will take freshly oxygenated blood out to disperse that to all of the tissues and organs. Okay. And then in between these chambers, so we have four main chambers, they're separated from each other by valves. So we're going to have four valves as well. We can think about these valves that separate atria from ventricle as AV or atrioventricular valves. On the right, it's the tricuspid. On the left, it's the bicuspid. And then we can think about the valves that separate the ventricle from the exiting vessel, both the aorta and the pulmonary artery. These are called semilunar valves. The pulmonary valve leaves the right ventricle to the pulmonary circulation, and the aortic valve leaves the left ventricle out into the systemic circulation by the aorta. So we'll talk about the details of that, but the overall flow of the heart is that blood has to pass through these four chambers and then two separate vascular circulations, the pulmonary circulation to pick up oxygen, the systemic circulation to drop that oxygen off for exchange at the tissue level. So here's just a more simplistic schematic of that, right? We want to think about the heart, and we sometimes draw the heart in this sort of heart-shaped way, but we want to think about the actual shape of the heart, where the ventricles at the bottom are actually thicker. They're thicker in their wall because of their role to eject blood out into the circulation. So let's think about the flow. So when blood leaves the left ventricle, it's going to go out into the arteries. And from here, it's going to go to arteries, then arterioles, and then eventually capillary beds. And this is constituting the systemic circulation because it's going out into the peripheral tissues to supply them with blood and oxygen and nutrients and to pick up their waste, which is carbon dioxide. And so that exchange happens at the level of the capillary bed. From there, it's going to go into venules, which are really tiny veins, then into veins, and then back to the right side of the heart. So all of this, left ventricle, arteries, arterioles, capillary beds, venules, veins, and back into the right atrium, that is the systemic circulation. All right, systemic circulation. From there now, oxygen-poor blood goes from the right atrium through that AV valve, tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle. And then from there, it goes out into the pulmonary circulation by way of the pulmonary artery. So again, although this is carrying poorly oxygenated blood, it is an artery because it's leaving the heart. So that goes through the pulmonary system, goes to the lungs, and here is where there's another capillary bed for exchange. In this instance, it's the opposite. Now we're picking up oxygen from the air that we breathe in. When we breathe air in, it goes down into the lungs, down to the alveoli, and this is where this gas exchange takes place. So we can pick up oxygen in that blood, and then we can drop off CO2 so that that can be exhaled out of the respiratory tract as well. From there, we go back to the heart via pulmonary veins, and this entire tract from the right ventricle to the lungs, back to the left atrium, that constitutes the pulmonary circulation. So we have two separate circulatory systems that are in series, right? They're in series to one another. So blood has to go through both circulations in order for gas exchange to be efficient. Okay, let's talk about the blood vessels. So we kind of just began looking at the types of blood vessels that we have, but let's talk a little bit more about their features and their function, their role in transporting blood. So we have the heart, which is where all of these vessels leave. And anything that's leaving the heart, we just described as an artery. So we have arteries, which are the largest of these structures. Then we have arterioles, which are smaller. These usually have more of a muscular wall. So the arteries are going to have a bigger structure, but they have more of a lumen. They have more space inside to carry blood. Arterioles are smaller and more of their walls are made of muscle. And then we have capillaries, which are very, very thin, much thinner than any of the other vessels. And that is needed. That is essential to the function of gas exchange, which takes place at these capillary beds. So capillaries are usually one cell layer thick in order for there to be adequate exchange across that layer. Then we have venules, which are really small veins. And venules and capillaries are really similar in their structure and function, very thin wall. And they also sort of help to have a little bit of exchange. You can see a little bit of exchange happening at venules, but overall, they're helping to converge to go back to the larger venous structures, which are veins. Okay, so veins are going to have uh, the direction back to the heart, and they're going to be bringing that blood that is picked up from venules and capillaries back to the heart. I also want to point out the high resistance in arterioles. So because of that thicker muscular wall internally, there's a lot of resistance that is present at the level of the arterioles as blood leaving the heart, leaving the large arteries, sort of meets the smaller lumen that is present at the arterioles. It hits a lot of resistance, almost like a wall, because of the smaller size of the arterioles and the thicker muscle, the smooth muscle in their walls. And so the arterioles can be a way for us to modulate resistance, okay, and help us to shunt blood from one tissue, one organ to the next by moderating the tone of the smooth muscle in the arterioles and therefore the resistance and therefore the flow. All right, let's think about the composition of blood. So blood is the major substance that is inside vessels. This is where all of the gases that we've been speaking about is being transported and exchanged. And blood is actually made of several cells and then some non-cellular components and then fluid. So the erythrocytes, also called red blood cells, these are one of the major components of blood. And these are going to constitute about 45% of the total blood volume. Okay. And we can see that this is the major part of the blood that has the oxygen bound to it. So erythrocytes have hemoglobin on them, and hemoglobin has spots on it to actually bind these gases. And so erythrocytes are the main sort of vehicle in the blood that is transporting gases. Leukocytes. So leukocytes are another cell type that are in blood, and they are a much smaller number. So together, leukocytes and platelets are about 1% of total blood volume. And leukocytes are our white blood cells. They are immune cells. They help to defend the body against pathogens, viruses, bacteria, etc. So leukocytes are the line of the it's a line of defense that's found within the blood to help begin to mount an immune response if there's any pathogen in the blood. Platelets, so this is another part of the, I don't want to say cell because these are not cells, these are sort of cellular fragments. So platelets start with big cells called megakaryocytes, and then those cells sort of explode into tiny fragments, and that is what makes a platelet. So platelet are really cellular fragments that are in the blood and help with blood clotting. So let's say you have a cut or an injury, these cellular fragments can aggregate at the site and begin to form a blood clot that will help to heal that wound as well as stop the bleeding. And then plasma. Plasma is going to be the fluid compartment, the fluid component of blood. It's going to have fluid, which is basically our extracellular fluid, and solutes. The solutes that are going to be in the blood are going to be electrolytes, sodium, potassium, etc., that are sort of dissociated in that fluid. All right, so if you think about the 100% of total blood volume, and the way that we do this, the way that you're seeing this separated here, is if you took blood, like let's say you took a small amount of blood from your vessel and you centrifuged it. You put it into a centrifuge that helps to separate it out by compartments. The buffy coat would be sort of separating the fluid, which would rise to the top, which is the plasma, about 55%. And then the cells would settle to the bottom, which would be the blood cells, 45%, and then the additional leukocytes and platelets, about 1% total. But typically in your body, these are not separated out by fluid and cells, right? They're all sort of mixed into this blood.